Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are looking at the ultimate cosmic scapegoat. We're exploring how the concept of the devil evolved from a celestial courtroom lawyer into a terrifying monster used to explain human suffering, control the masses, and invalidate competing religions. From ancient child sacrifices and levitating beds to a 900-foot mysterious rock and a 6,000-year theological bet between God and Satan, we are uncovering the mechanics of belief and the lengths humanity goes to answer the problem of evil.
It's honestly an incredibly revealing journey into the human psyche.
Yeah.
I mean, it fundamentally changes how you look at the entire architecture of religious systems.
Yeah, totally. And to map out that architecture, we are pulling from a really fascinating stack of sources today. We have a detailed breakdown of the Jehovah's Witness theological worldview, which paints this highly structured, almost corporate picture of the devil.
Right. Very systematic.
Exactly. And alongside that, we have historical documentation exploring cultural manifestations of evil. So things like the history of ancient and modern exorcisms, the bizarre mass panic over the Jersey Devil, and the geological mystery of Devil's Tower.
Quite a mix.
It is. And our mission today is to evaluate these sources through an analytical and, somewhat atheistic or theological lens to understand the deeper why. Like, why do so many belief systems seem to absolutely require a dark counterpart to God?
That is the big question.
Right. And before we get into it, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. So I have to ask you, the listener, have you ever stopped to wonder why an all-powerful, all-knowing deity would need an arch-enemy in the first place? I mean, it feels like a massive structural contradiction.
Well, for sure. That contradiction is, well, it's the central tension of almost every major Western theology.
Right.
Because if a creator deity is entirely in charge and fundamentally good, the existence of a formidable opposition force requires a lot of philosophical heavy lifting to justify.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the sources point out something about the theological origins of this ultimate villain that completely flips the script on how most people view the Bible.
Yeah, the history is wild.
It really is. In the original text of the Old Testament, the word Satan didn't mean, a red guy with a pitchfork ruling an underworld. It literally just translated to opposer or adversary in Hebrew.
Right, it functioned as a title or a role, not a proper name.
Exactly. And even crazier, that famous snake in the Garden of Eden in Genesis, the original authors never claimed that was Satan.
No, they don't.
It was presented simply as a talking serpent. The actual character of this Satan really starts showing up in texts like the Book of Job, but not as an evil overlord. He's actually part of God's celestial court.
Just one of the staff, basically.
Right. He is basically working for Yahweh as a sort of divine prosecutor. I was reading this and thinking, it's like Satan started out as God's internal auditor, just checking the books to make sure humans were actually loyal. And then over a few centuries, he was entirely rebranded as a hostile takeover CEO.
That is a great analogy. And what's fascinating here is exactly when and how that rebrand happened. The historical records in our sources pinpoint the Second Temple period, so roughly around 500 BCE.
Okay, so a long time after the early texts.
Right. The Jewish people had experienced the Babylonian exile and were living under the massive influence of the Persian Empire.
Got it.
And that geographic and political shift meant they were suddenly rubbing shoulders with the Persian religion, Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism operated on a very rigid, clearly defined dualism.
Good versus evil.
Exactly. Ahura Mazda was the supreme god of light, and an Angra Mainyu was the distinct autonomous spirit of evil and darkness.
Oh, wow. So the exiled Jewish scholars essentially encountered this concept of a supreme bad guy and just imported it into their own theology.
They adapted it, yeah. And they did so out of sheer theological necessity. If we evaluate this strictly from an analytical or atheistic perspective, you realize this shift was the ultimate answer to the problem of evil.
Right, because how do you explain bad things happening?
Exactly. When your temple has been destroyed and your people are suffering in exile, it is incredibly difficult to convince your population that there is an all-good, all-powerful God watching over them. You look out the window and see disease, famine, cruelty.
You can't blame an all-loving God for bone cancer or war without making him look entirely apathetic or, malicious.
Precisely. To protect the pristine image of a benevolent God from the devastating reality of human suffering, theology required a scapegoat.
Enter Satan.
Right. Satan evolved into that necessary entity to absorb the blame. Without the concept of the devil, the entire premise of a purely loving creator collapses under the weight of observable human trauma.
That makes profound sense.
Yeah.
It's a structural mechanism to keep the core belief intact. And Building on how theology needs that scapegoat, we transition in the sources to how one specific modern religion, Jehovah's Witnesses, takes this concept so far that they accidentally make Satan the main character of the Bible.
It is a striking shift in the narrative focus. The entire human experience is recontextualized around his actions.
The sources dive deep into JW doctrine, and the structure of it is fascinating. In their worldview, Satan wasn't created evil. He was a perfect angel who developed wrong desires and decided to challenge Jehovah's right to rule, his universal sovereignty, they call it.
Right, the right to govern the universe.
Yeah. And because of this challenge in the Garden of Eden, God was supposedly forced to prove a point to all the other billions of angels watching. Everything that follows, including the sacrifice of Jesus, is essentially a backup plan. Satan is the one actually driving the plot forward.
He becomes the catalyst for the entirety of human history, according to this framework.
And the source material highlights a highly specific analogy that Jehovah's Witnesses use to explain this setup to the public. They call it the teacher and rebellious student illustration.
Oh, right. I remember reading this.
Yeah, it goes like this. Imagine a teacher in a classroom, and a rebellious student stands up and loudly claims, "Your teaching methods are wrong, I can do it better." To prove to the rest of the class that the student is incompetent, the teacher hands over the chalk and lets the rebellious student teach the class.
And that represents Satan taking over.
Exactly. That, they say, is why God has allowed Satan to rule the earth for 6,000 years, resulting in all human suffering. It proves Satan is a failure.
It's a very neat little package, right?
Well, yeah, but I have to aggressively push back on this because logically, it falls apart the second you apply it to the real world.
Oh, totally.
If a real teacher in a real school let a rebellious student inflict suffering on the rest of the class, like letting them bully, torment, and actively harm the other students for years just to save face and prove a point about their own teaching credentials.
They'd be fired instantly.
Fired, stripped of their credentials, and probably arrested. How does this prove God's ultimate righteousness? I was genuinely confused reading this justification.
Yet your confusion points to the exact friction of the theology. When we synthesize this, it reveals the immense mental gymnastics required to reconcile a supposedly loving deity with worldly trauma.
Right.
The JWs lean heavily on the biblical story of Job to justify this. Jehovah allows Satan to strip Job of his wealth, destroy his health, and literally kill his children. For what purpose?
To win a bet.
To settle a cosmic bet about loyalty, yeah. To give humans a chance to prove Satan a liar.
It's reducing actual human trauma, grief, chronic illness, death, to a strategic move on a cosmic chessboard.
In this framework, human beings are reduced to pawns. The actual emotional and physical reality of your suffering is secondary to the legalistic need to vindicate God's authority.
Wow.
It's a deeply troubling way that a belief system manages to rationalize the absolute worst parts of existence, effectively saying your pain is just collateral damage in a boardroom dispute between deities.
And if the universe is this active, ongoing war zone between God and Satan, how does that cosmic battle weaponize fear in the everyday lives of believers? Because the sources make it clear that this doesn't just stay in the theological clouds, it comes right down into your living room.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It fundamentally dictates the minutiae of daily life and rewires how a person interacts with mundane objects.
According to the JW timeline in the sources, Satan and his demons were literally passed down to Earth in the year 1914 after a massive heavenly war with Michael the Archangel. The literature describes these demons as acting like rabid dogs backed into a corner, furious because they know their time is running out.
Which creates an intense atmosphere of paranoia.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because of this belief, the everyday physical world becomes completely saturated with unseen demonic threats. We're talking bizarre urban legends spreading like wildfire through the congregations.
The policing of the environment becomes entirely consuming.
The sources mention pervasive stories of demonic Smurf dolls getting up and walking right out of kingdom halls.
I mean, walking Smurfs. It's surreal.
Right. People genuinely believing their beds are levitating at night because they unwittingly kept a forbidden occult item, like a secondhand antique, in the house. The idea that entirely innocent things, a plastic toy wizard, watching a fantasy movie with magic in it, or letting a kid celebrate Halloween, are literal, functional gateways for demonic possession.
We really have to look at the psychological mechanics of that. This isn't just a spooky campfire culture. It's a form of phobia induction and milieu control.
Yeah.
But to bring in the broader historical context from our second source, this hypervigilance isn't new. If you go back thousands of years to the Valley of Hinnom, just outside
Yeah.
ancient Jerusalem.
Right. The physical place that gives us Gehenna.
Exactly, the literal theological concept of hell.
Yeah.
You find archaeological and historical evidence of child sacrifices there.
Ah.
People were throwing their firstborn children into fires. Why? Because they believed that if they didn't actively appease dark spirits or demons, the rains wouldn't come and their crops would fail.
So they were trying to manufacture a sense of control over an uncontrollable, terrifying environment through brutal rituals.
Precisely. The human mind desperately wants cause and effect. And that belief in a literal, physical manifestation of evil carries right through to the modern era. We have documentation in the sources of Pope Francis performing what many consider an exorcism in St. Peter's Square in 2013, laying hands on a man in a wheelchair believed to be possessed.
Wow, yeah.
The Catholic perspective on this is incredibly detailed, documenting claims of unexplainable physical phenomena, people exhibiting superhuman strength, speaking unknown languages, or even levitation.
Yeah, the sources mention priests claiming they've seen people float in midair, which, I mean, from a scientific standpoint, entirely breaks the laws of physics.
It does. But what's notable is the modern Catholic Church's strategic approach to these claims today. The source notes that contemporary exorcists often aim to heal on two tracks simultaneously, the spiritual level and the psychological level.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they recognize that what they view as demonic activity almost always feeds on internal psychological wounds, deep-seated anger, and severe trauma.
So they are effectively acknowledging that the human mind and severe emotional distress plays a massive role in what outwardly manifests as a demon.
The line between acute psychological distress and spiritual warfare is heavily blurred, even by the practitioners themselves. But if we evaluate this from an atheistic or purely psychological lens, we have to point out the incredible cognitive toll of this worldview.
How so?
Well, in the JW source, they frequently quote 1 Corinthians 10:21. That's the doctrine that you cannot sit at the table of Jehovah and the table of demons at the same time.
Meaning that every single choice of entertainment, every book you read, every thrift store purchase is you actively choosing a side in a cosmic war.
Exactly. If you are conditioned to be constantly terrified that a cartoon or a souvenir amulet is going to invite a malevolent entity into your home to destroy your family, your entire life is paralyzed by cognitive dissonance and fear.
It sounds exhausting.
It is. And strategically speaking, fear of the devil is the ultimate mechanism for religious retention. If the outside world is not just ideologically wrong, but actively controlled by a supernatural predator looking to devour you, leaving the safety of the group isn't just a change of mind.
It's spiritual suicide.
Exactly.
Brilliantly effective system of control.
No.
And this fear isn't just used to keep believers inside the walls, it's actively weaponized to cancel out the validity of anyone else's faith.
Oh, it serves a powerful dual purpose in insulating the believer.
The JW source reveals this fascinating psychological trick. Imagine a Jehovah's Witnesses out knocking on doors, and they meet a devout Catholic who says, "I know my faith is true because I was healed after seeing a vision of the Virgin Mary." Or they meet a Pentecostal who genuinely speaks in tongues.
Right.
The JW doesn't actually have to deny that a supernatural event took place. They don't have to call the person a liar or try to disprove the healing medically. They just instantly label it as a demonic trick.
It's Satan in disguise.
Yeah. They say it's Satan disguising himself as an angel of light to mislead people away from the true religion.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is a ubiquitous, highly effective tool used across almost all exclusive religious frameworks.
Yeah. Like who else?
Think about traditional Christianity dismissing the historical revelations of Muhammad in Islam, or brushing off the visions of Joseph Smith in Mormonism.
Right.
The easiest, most frictionless way to deal with competing spiritual experiences isn't to disprove them historically or scientifically. It's to categorize them as demonic deception.
So what does this all mean? Like, if every single religion is pointing at the other's profound spiritual experiences and miracles and saying that's just the devil tricking you, where does that leave the believer?
It leaves the believer safely locked inside a self-sealing ideological bubble. This is a crucial atheistic takeaway. If every piece of external evidence that supports a competing religion is automatically classified as a trick by Satan, the believer never has to genuinely confront the possibility that other faiths might be just as valid as theirs.
It just shuts down the conversation.
Completely. More importantly, it acts as a cognitive shield. It prevents them from considering the most logical secular conclusion, that all of these visions, feelings of euphoria, and perceived miracles, including their own, might simply be psychologically generated by the human brain. The devil does the heavy lifting of protecting their worldview from critical analysis.
It's a built-in firewall against critical thinking. But this mechanism of blaming the devil doesn't just happen inside our minds or in our theological debates. It actually bleeds out into how we map the physical world.
That's very true.
When humanity encounters geography or biology that breaks the rules of nature as we understand them, we apply that exact same demonic label.
Geography and local folklore become deeply intertwined with this theological placeholder for the unknown.
Take Devil's Tower in Wyoming, for example. This is a massive 900-foot anomalous rock formation that just shoots straight up out of the flat sedimentary plains.
And there's no volcanic activity around there.
Right, none. To explain it easily anyway. It is so visually jarring and utterly bizarre that it was famously featured in the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind as an alien landing site.
A classic.
Yeah. Now, long before Hollywood, Native American tribes revered it as a sacred altar and understood its spiritual significance to their culture. But when early European settlers arrived and lacked the geological science to make sense of this massive anomaly, what did they name it? Devil's Tower.
It becomes the default linguistic placeholder for human ignorance.
Exactly. And the folklore gets even more intense when you look at the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. This is an isolation zone of 1 million acres of dense, dark, terrifying woods.
Not a place you want to get lost in at night.
Definitely not. And according to local legend, it's home to the Jersey Devil. The origin story is straight out of an 18th century horror movie. In 1735, a woman named Mother Leeds was giving birth to her 13th child. Exhausted and in pain, she supposedly cried out, "The devil can take this one." Right. And according to the myth, the baby morphed into a winged, horse-headed monster with a forked tail, killed the midwife, and flew up the chimney into the pines.
A literal demon born of human flesh, deeply rooted in the anxieties of colonial life.
But the sources detail how it wasn't just a spooky story to keep kids out of the woods. In 1909, there was an absolute mass panic.
Really, a mass panic.
Yeah. This was a communal hysteria where businesses and schools were shut down across the region. A trolley car was supposedly dive-bombed by the creature. The Philadelphia Zoo offered a $10,000 reward for its capture.
Wow.
Even historical figures were woven into the legend. Commodore Stephen Decatur, a famous naval hero, supposedly visited a foundry in the area, saw the creature, shot a cannonball right through its wing, and watched it just keep flying.
This raises an important question about the sociological mechanics of how we process fear and communal anxiety. The 1909 panic is a perfect case study in mass hysteria.
Because it just fed on itself.
Exactly. When isolated communities experience high stress, that anxiety often physically manifests as sightings of a shared cultural monster.
Yeah.
Furthermore, long before colonists arrived with their European concepts of Satan, the Lenape Native Americans called the Pine Barrens the place of the dragon.
So they knew it was spooky, too.
They recognized there was something unsettling about the environment, yeah. When we lack a scientific understanding of complex geology, like how a 900-foot magma plug formed, or we don't have the biological classifications to identify the strange screeches of an owl in the dark woods at night, our minds abhor that vacuum. We fill the void of our own scientific ignorance with the devil.
It is so much easier and somehow more comforting to say a monster made that noise than to admit we don't have the scientific tools to understand our environment yet.
The devil becomes the ultimate catch-all explanation for the limits of human knowledge, both internally and externally.
So to pull all of these threads together, we've watched the concept of the devil evolve from an ancient celestial prosecutor just doing his job auditing humanity in the Old Testament into this incredibly convenient theological scapegoat designed to solve the problem of evil and protect the image of a benevolent God.
Right.
We've seen how organizations weaponize that fear to exert immense psychological control, inducing phobias to build cognitive walls against competing ideas and critical thought. And finally, we've seen how the devil serves as a historical placeholder for our own scientific ignorance when facing the mysteries of the physical world. I mean, it is a stunningly versatile man-made concept.
It truly is a masterclass in human adaptation. And synthesizing all of this leaves us with a profound realization about human nature.
Yeah.
If humanity created the concept of the devil to act as a cosmic scapegoat for all our worst impulses, our inexplicable tragedies, and our unexplained phenomena, what happens to human accountability when we finally outgrow him? If there is no ultimate adversary pulling the strings in the dark, we are left with a far more terrifying realization. The capacity for immense evil and the absolute responsibility to stop it rests entirely in our own hands.
That is a heavy but incredibly necessary thought to end on. Taking ownership of our own actions and our own world without needing a monster in the dark to blame it on. Thank you to everyone listening for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives around you, look closely at the things that scare you, and we'll see you next time.